The hall is silent. Not with peace, but with the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, thick and unmoving, like velvet soaked in wax. Candles burn low, their smoke curling through the air like incense over a tomb. You can hear it, the hush of robes gliding across polished stone, the soft clink of rosary beads, the wheeze of breath held too long by someone afraid to inhale too deeply. You are standing inside the most sacred chamber of the Spanish court. Every surface gleams. Every wall is clothed in tapestries of saints and silver thread. Gold leaf clings to the edges of sacred texts stacked beside the throne. And in the very center, raised just above all others, untouched by dust or disorder, she sits. Queen Isabella. La Cattolica. Her hands folded like prayer. Her lips barely parted, moving silently through Latin verses. Her eyes closed. Her stillness, absolute. But something is wrong. You smell it before you see it. It begins as a whisper beneath the myrrh and sandalwood. A faint sourness. Something warm and animal. Not fresh. Not new. Not rot exactly, but something that should not linger inside a chamber of saints. A heat. A dampness in the air that does not belong to candlelight or breath. And then it thickens. The scent gathers behind her robes. It crawls from beneath the layers of wool and lace and velvet. It seeps into the seams of her gown, where the fabric touches flesh. A body not bathed, not touched by water, not cleansed by anything but prayer. You glance at the others in the room. No one reacts. Not the guards. Not the priests. Not the ladies-in-waiting who hover at the edge of her scent. They've grown used to it. Or worse, they believe it's holy. Because she told them it was. Because she believes it is. This is not a queen who wallows in indulgence. This is not a monarch who fears discomfort. This is a woman who has baptized herself in denial. Who sees cleanliness not as virtue, but as vanity. Her flesh is not a body, it is a relic. To wash it would be to desecrate it. So she sits. Wrapped in the trappings of empire. Draped in the illusion of sanctity. But underneath? She stinks. Not just of sweat. Not just of illness. But of years of refusal. Of sheets never laundered. Of sores left to fester beneath silk. Of linen stiffened with salt. Of blood never washed clean. Of a life lived in ritual, but never in renewal. You are close enough now to see the powder clinging to her jawline. The dry crust at the corner of her mouth. The dark sheen of sweat beneath her veil. Her hairline is soaked, but not from washing. The scent of lavender cannot compete. And still, she prays. Still, the court kneels before her. Still, the world writes her as holy. You've heard the legends. The piety. The conquest. The crown of Castile and the crown of Aragon joined beneath her hands. You know the glory. The power. The legacy. But no one told you how she smelled. No one wrote that down. Because the myth of Isabella is too clean. Too polished. Too sacred. But she wasn't. She was devout. She was cunning. She was a queen forged in iron and blood. But she was also unwashed. Unbathed. Untouched by water for decades. The woman who sent ships across oceans, who funded inquisitions and shaped empires, sat for years inside her own skin and let it decay around her. Her body, a battlefield she chose never to clean. Her purity, a myth soaked in sweat. And you're about to see it all. Not the sanitized version. Not the one sealed behind portraits and parchment. But the truth. We're not here to mock her. We're here to exhume her. Layer by layer. Scent by scent. Century by silent century. The air in 15th century Spain was thick, not just with incense, but with fear. Fear of hellfire. Fear of sin. Fear of the flesh. You can feel it in the architecture, church spires stabbing toward heaven like warnings. In the hymns, long, mournful songs echoing through stone cathedrals where light filters through stained glass like judgment. In the silence between confessions, where guilt is not whispered, but inhaled. This is not a time for comfort. It is a time for suffering. And suffering, they believed, made you holy. The body was not a temple to cherish. It was a battlefield to conquer. Every hunger was a trap. Every pleasure, a test. And no temptation was more treacherous than the one that came through the skin. Cleanliness, in this world, was not a virtue. It was a vanity. To scrub one's flesh was to acknowledge it. To care for it was to indulge it. And indulgence was the gateway to ruin. Water, warm and soothing, opened the pores, and they believed that evil slipped in through those open gates. The devil was clever. He didn't always come in blood or war. Sometimes, he came in steam. This was especially true for women. Women were seen as vessels of temptation, dangerously tied to the earth. Their bodies were leaky, unpredictable, bleeding, desiring. To bathe a woman was to risk awakening what should stay dormant. To touch her skin, even with water, was to invite corruption. And so, they cloaked their daughters in wool, wrapped their wives in linen, and taught their queens to pray the filth away. It was cleaner to stink with piety than to glisten with soap. Queen Isabella was born into this world. Not just into castles and courts, but into a theology of fear. Her education was shaped by friars who spoke more about hell than heaven. They did not teach her to dance, or to laugh, or to know her reflection in a basin of water. They taught her to deny. To deny her appetites. To deny her pleasures. To deny the very body she ruled from. From the time she could speak, she was taught that purity was pain. That the holiest women were the ones who bore their filth like saints bore their wounds. And she believed it. By the time she was crowned, Isabella wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol. A sword in God's hand. A ruler with a rosary. Her body did not belong to her anymore. It belonged to Spain. To Christ. To legend. And if it rotted beneath her robes? That was the price of divinity. She conquered Granada with a heart full of righteousness and skin crawling with lice. She expelled entire populations with the same hands that had not touched water in weeks. She ruled with a mind sharpened by scripture, but a body cloaked in ritual neglect. Because to wash would be to feel. And to feel would be to fall. You wonder what the court whispered behind silk fans when she passed. If they smelled the sour beneath the sanctity. If they knew that their queen, the most powerful woman in Europe, slept on sheets that hadn't seen soap in years. But they would never speak of it. Not aloud. Not in that world. Not in a world where unwashed skin meant unsullied soul. And so the myth grew. The Holy Queen. The chosen of Christ. The conqueror of the Moors. The mother of the Inquisition. But under that crown was a scalp never rinsed. Beneath the gilded cross on her chest, a body bound in sweat. This was not a woman untouched by sin. This was a woman untouched by water. And now you know. You know that the world she built was not born of purity, but of pain. That behind every victory was a body left to fester. That the empire she forged was scrubbed clean in books, but never in truth. And if you're still watching, still breathing in this history we were never meant to smell, then ask yourself, why haven't you subscribed to Tale of History yet? You've stood inside her silence. You've unwrapped the lie. Don't stop here. Click that button. Or walk into the comments and tell us, honestly, why you'd rather look away. Why you'd rather preserve the perfume than confront the stench. But we both know the truth. You're here because you crave what the history books refuse to reveal. And we will show it to you all. Close your eyes. Picture a queen. Not the caricature crowned in fairy tales, but a living, breathing woman wrapped in velvet and fear, both stitched into the seams of her robe. Now strip away the fantasy. Strip away the perfume, the portraits, the parades. What you're left with is a body untouched by water. Isabella of Castile did not wash. Not out of poverty. Not out of neglect. But out of conviction. Twice. That is what the records suggest. Twice in her entire life did the Holy Queen submit her body to water, once, when she first entered the world, slick with birth, and again, on the eve of her marriage, when politics demanded she be presentable. Not clean. Acceptable. The rest? She refused. Because to bathe, in her mind, was not hygiene. It was hubris. You see, in the eyes of Isabella, and the world that shaped her, water was not innocent. It was not purity in liquid form. It was danger. A temptation. A softening of the flesh that led straight into the jaws of sin. To bathe was to linger. To feel. To indulge. And Isabella would not indulge. Not in laughter. Not in silk for pleasure's sake. Not in her own body. The Church did not merely encourage abstinence from touch or intimacy, they elevated filth as sacred. To wear your unwashed skin like armor meant you were strong. To stink beneath your cloak meant you were holy. Because the devil, they said, was drawn to warmth. To softness. To smooth, bare skin. Better to be a wall of wool and sweat than a doorway. So Isabella embraced the stench. She did not see her own odor as offense. She saw it as evidence. Of faith. Of sacrifice. Of a soul too focused on eternity to bother with soap. And she would not let her servants interfere. There were rules. Written. Whispered. Implied. No one was to bring her water for bathing unless instructed. No one was to suggest she cleanse. No cloth dipped in warm basins. No buckets carried behind curtains. No lavender in bowls. If she wanted fragrance, she wore it. But never in the form of cleanliness. She believed in incense, not steam. In oils for anointing, not scrubbing. In ashes on the forehead, not lather on the back. Even the court grew accustomed to it. Adjusted. Adapted. They learned to smile at a distance. To speak from just outside the radius where breath met air. To perfume the corridors instead of the queen. Isabella did not care. Her court was not a place for weakness. Her skin was not a subject of vanity. It was her shame, and her shield. There are rumors, of course. Always whispers. That behind closed doors, her linens fused to her skin. That sores opened where sweat never dried. That her thighs carried the chafed weight of unrelieved cloth. But no chronicler dared write it plainly. They painted her as sanctified. And in a way, they weren't wrong. She had sanctified herself. With rot. With silence. With stubbornness. You picture her now, sitting in her chapel, unmoving. Her hands clasped. Her jaw set. Her gown sealed tight around her neck. Dust clings to her veil. Her shoes stick slightly when she shifts her feet. The scent is inescapable, both holy and human. That was the queen. The woman who feared water more than death. Because death was the end. But water? Water opened the door to weakness. And she would not be weak. Not to her enemies. Not to her body. Not even to the basin. And you? You've just heard a queen equate water with wickedness. You followed her down the dark hallway of history, past gold leaf and sacred cloth, into a room no one wants to admit existed. And yet, you're still watching. Still here. but not subscribed. You can't pretend this is history you've heard before. You can't unsee the filth beneath the crown. So don't just lurk in the shadows of the past. Click now. Or step into the comments and tell us, honestly, why you prefer ignorance over immersion. Because we're just getting started. They shimmer when you see them in the paintings. Gowns of crushed velvet, damask glinting in candlelight, sleeves so heavy with embroidery they seem carved from gold. Layer upon layer, each hem more lavish than the last, clothes not just to be worn, but to declare power. To demand reverence. But step closer. Breathe in. And the illusion begins to unravel. Because Queen Isabella's garments, those royal vestments wrapped around her body like armor, were not what they seemed. They were not clean. They were never truly clean. They were relics of decay. These were not clothes that touched soap and sun. These were clothes that touched flesh. Flesh that never met water. Flesh that sweated beneath wool. That bled into linen. That flaked and cracked and wept beneath corsets pulled so tight they carved red welts into the skin. The gowns were beautiful, yes. But they were tombs. Every thread remembered something the court refused to speak of. The royal laundries, what little they were, did not wash. They perfumed. They aired. They turned inside out and dusted. But rarely, if ever, did a garment of the queen touch boiling water. Rarely did soap sting the seams where her sweat had pooled. Undergarments, those intimate layers closest to the skin, were worn until they stiffened with salt. Streaked with the pale yellow of old perspiration. Marked by the faint iron blush of dried blood. And still, they remained. To discard them was wasteful. To clean them was unthinkable. You have to understand the mindset, clothes were not just fashion. They were status. They were sanctity. Washing them risked damaging the embroidery, dulling the richness. And worse, it meant admitting the body inside had failed to stay pure. So they were preserved. Layered with rose oil and crushed herbs. Stuffed with dried lavender and sewn with cinnamon bark. Sometimes rosemary. Sometimes juniper. Anything that smelled like distance, like not being human. But the body always bled through. Imagine stepping into her wardrobe. Imagine the smell that lived in the folds of her sleeves. The faint sourness at the shoulder where breath had warmed the fabric too long. The tang of mildew hiding in the pleats of skirts worn through endless summers, never laundered, only hidden in cedar chests. Her gowns became extensions of her skin. Aged, heavy, aromatic with history and rot. And they were not hers alone. Because royal clothes were passed down. From queen to daughter. From cousin to niece. Gowns altered, resized, restitched. But not refreshed. They carried the imprint of every woman who wore them. Each one a tapestry of skin cells, perfume, and silence. What you wore wasn't just fabric. It was a confession. And Isabella? She wore the same confession every day. A closed loop of linen, wool, and pride. Even the most sacred gowns, the ones she wore to church, to coronations, to battles of diplomacy, held the residue of her own neglect. She believed it was enough to mask. Enough to press civet-scented gloves to her collar. Enough to drape herself in righteousness. The court watched. They said nothing. What was a little odor, compared to empire? What was a little dampness beneath the seams, compared to divine right? No one dared suggest she change. No one dared ask how often the cloth beneath her ribs was replaced. No one dared mention the stiffness of her corset. The yellowing of her sleeves. Not even when she stood for hours beneath a blazing Spanish sun. Not even when the wool darkened at her spine. Not even when a lady-in-waiting flinched as she helped her undress. Because queens don't sweat. Queens don't rot. And queens, holy queens, do not need to be clean. You think you know royalty. You think of elegance, of grace, of the soft rustle of silk as a monarch glides across a marble floor. But now you see her. Still. Swollen with heat. Wrapped in robes that smell of everything the painters left out. This is what history hides behind the frame. And if you've made it this far, if you've stepped into this darkness, if you've walked through the folds of a gown never washed, then ask yourself, why haven't you subscribed to Tale of History yet? This isn't a fable. This is the fabric of truth. Click. Before it's dust. Or, if you refuse, step into the comments and tell us why. Tell us why you'd rather keep the paintings clean than admit the gowns were filthy. The bed of a queen. You imagine silk. Ivory canopies. Pillows as light as breath. A place where empires rest their head. Where the fate of nations dreams in gold-stitched linens and perfumed air. But not this bed. Not Isabella's. Her bed, the bed, was not a sanctuary. It was a coffin that never closed. From the outside, it was regal, carved mahogany posts, heavy curtains dyed in crushed cochineal, a frame that groaned with weight and age. But inside, beneath the velvet, beneath the polish, beneath the image, it was rotting. Because she never changed it. Never replaced the straw-stuffed mattress. Never stripped it bare to cleanse what lingered inside. She simply lay upon it, night after night, year after year. Until the wood bent beneath her bones and the stuffing drank her sweat like blood into soil. What started as softness hardened. The straw compacted into filth-slick masses. Moisture seeped in. Parasites followed. Lice nested deep in the seams. Fleas laid eggs in the corners. Mites scurried between the threads, feasting on dead skin, on warmth, on stillness. And it wasn't just her. Every breath, every fevered dream, every hour of sleep poured salt and dampness into the bed. It became her second skin, but unlike skin, it was never shed. It absorbed everything. And it gave nothing back. Lavender. That was the court solution. They placed it beneath her pillow. They sewed it into sachets and tied them with silver ribbon. They burned rosemary nearby. They hung bundles of dried flowers from the canopy and called it purity. But it was camouflage. Because the stink was never banished. Only dressed. The queen slept not in comfort, but in penance. She saw her sores not as signs of infection, but of holy trial. The red wheals that formed on her thighs where the mattress scratched, the scabbing at her ankles, the irritated skin behind her knees, those were not symptoms. They were symbols. Proof that her faith had chosen her to suffer. Servants noticed. Of course they did. They watched as she shifted in the mornings, stiff from sleep, rubbing her arms as though scouring off invisible chains. They glimpsed the stains on her sheets, brown with time, yellow with dampness. They heard her murmurs at night, not in pain, but in prayer. Not asking for release. Asking for endurance. Because in her mind, the body was not meant for ease. It was not to be pampered or preserved. It was to be tested. She had seen women, lesser women, in her view, fall to softness. To indulgence. She would not. Her chamber was a chapel. Her mattress, a crucible. Her sores, sermons. You imagine it now. That bed, heavy with years. The scent of dust and old breath. The flutter of insect wings hidden just beneath the ticking. The faded edge of her pillow, darkened where her temple rested night after night. A place meant for rest turned into something more primal. Something feral. And she never fled from it. She returned, willingly, again and again. As though each night were a vow. As though her empire was sustained not by politics, or armies, or gold. But by how long she could sleep in the filth and not break. There is power in that. Not comfort. Not wisdom. But power. The kind of power that comes from knowing the stench of your sanctity and choosing to wear it anyway. Now ask yourself, why are you still watching? You've seen her cradle herself in sanctified filth. You've stood in the shadow of her bed and smelled what centuries tried to forget. You've learned what history dares not teach. And still, you haven't subscribed to Tale of History. She denied herself water. You're denying yourself truth. Explain that in the comments. We'll wait. Her crown may have been golden, but beneath it, something far less radiant thrived. Isabella's head, always covered. Always veiled. Not out of modesty alone, but out of ritual. A spiritual practice. A sacred concealment. To expose her scalp, even to her most trusted handmaidens, would have been a breach not just of privacy, but of piety. So her hair became a secret. And secrets, when left untouched, begin to rot. The court saw only the edges, the glimpses that slipped from beneath her veil as she bowed to pray. Strands matted against her neck. A dull sheen clinging to the nape. Not the shimmer of royalty, but the oil of days, weeks, gathered in silence. Because her hair was never brushed clean. Not with water. Not with care. Not with the kind of gentleness reserved for women who saw their flesh as worthy. Her hair became a shrine to denial. It tangled. It knotted. It fused at the roots where sweat pooled and dried in rings. Dead skin flaked but never left, layering into the strands like parchment in a sacred text. Oil darkened the color from chestnut to near black. And woven through it all, moving, breeding, surviving, were lice. Not a few. Not the occasional infestation whispered about in peasant villages. But generations. Nests built beneath her veil. Colonies forming in the heat beneath her skull. Lice fat with blood. Eggs glued to the shafts of hair, like rosary beads threaded through strands of suffering. And she knew. Of course she knew. You can't feel that kind of crawling and mistake it for grace. But she didn't remove them. She didn't treat them. She didn't scream or shudder. She endured. Because to her, the lice were not pests. They were penance. Tiny trials delivered by God Himself. Living reminders of humility. Of mortality. Of discipline. She saw them the way monks saw fasting, the way martyrs saw flame, necessary. Holy. A torment that purified. So she wore them. Like a crown no one could see. And when the itching became unbearable, when blood welled at her scalp from too much scratching, she didn't wash. She soaked her veils in myrrh. Not to heal. Not to cleanse. But to conceal. A fragrant light draped across a festering truth. Myrrh. One of the gifts given to Christ at His birth. A symbol of burial and divinity. Isabella wrapped herself in it not for beauty, but for ritual. Her veil, soaked in it, clung to her scalp like incense clings to stone. The scent masked the oil. Masked the blood. Masked the insects. But it did not remove them. You imagine her now, seated at her altar, head bowed, veil heavy with resin and heat. Lice moving beneath it like prayers unanswered. The buzz of sacred silence. The ache behind her ears where the nests pulsed. And she never flinched. She would not. Could not. Not when her kingdom balanced on the edge of her self-control. To rip the veil from her head would be to admit weakness. To allow water to touch her scalp would be to let the world in. And Isabella refused the world. She chose the veil. Chose the lice. Chose the rot. And so history remembers her as pure. But you know better now. You've seen the truth combed from her hair, strand by strand, egg by egg, penance by penance. And still, you haven't subscribed to Tale of History. You followed her through sweat and silence. Through beds that reeked and crowns that crawled. What more do you need? Click subscribe. Or enter the comments and tell the lice, even, why you'd rather stay comfortable than crawl deeper into the past. We won't judge. But we won't stop scratching either. Her mouth opened, and the room flinched. Not because of what she said. Not even because of how she said it. But because of what escaped. The scent was sharp, like copper soaked in vinegar, sweet at the edges, but foul where it settled in the throat. It wasn't the perfume of wine or myrrh or cloves. It was deeper. Older. Closer to death than decay. The scent of something dying, still alive. And it lived inside her mouth. They called it holy. They called it piety. They called it anything but what it was, a wound. A wound that never closed. Isabella's teeth had long surrendered. To sugar, to time, to the rot she refused to acknowledge. She drank communion wine every day, deep red, heavy, spiced with meaning. It stained the grooves of her molars. It soaked into the gums. And it fed what festered there. She didn't brush. The practice was foreign, even scandalous to her circle. Instead, she rinsed. Not with mint or oil, but with more wine. Sometimes salt. Sometimes vinegar. And always prayer. It was said that when she smiled, on the rare occasions she did, her gums bled. Bright and sudden, like a wound reopened. And still, she smiled through it. Still, she spoke. Still, she recited scripture. Each syllable tinged with the tang of rot. Because her mouth wasn't just a place of speech, it was a temple. And temples were not scrubbed. They were preserved. So she let it fester. She welcomed the pain, as she welcomed all pain, with devotion. As if each throb, each infected crevice in her jaw, brought her closer to the divine. Advisors learned to stand at a distance. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths. Servants learned to lower their gaze when the queen opened hers. But they never spoke of it. Not openly. Not clearly. They feared her wrath, yes. But more than that, they feared the faith that armored her decay. She was never more terrifying than when she prayed aloud. Because each verse, each passage, each sacred word rolled out through that wound of a mouth, wrapped in the scent of blood, bile, and ancient sugar. It wasn't just breath. It was evidence. That even in rot, she reigned. Even in stench, she was sanctified. Imagine being that close. Imagine kneeling before her throne. The hem of her gown inches from your face. The air thick. Her hand raised. Her lips parting, and the smell hits first. A rush of warmth and ruin. A reminder that beneath the holiness was still a body. Still mortal. Still slowly dying in the name of something greater. She believed her words could transcend flesh. But her flesh dragged them down. And now you know. You've smelled what Scripture tried to cover. You've tasted the past, not in books, not in paintings, but in blood-soaked gums and wine-soured breath. And you still haven't subscribed to Tale of History? She praised the Lord through infected gums. You won't even click a button. Do it now. Let her silence haunt you no longer. Or go ahead, step into the comments and explain. Tell us why you'd rather keep the myth, and bury the woman. It sat beneath her altar. A simple thing. Clay, glazed in white. No gold, no filigree, no royal crest. Just a vessel, stained and sweating in the heat of the Castilian sun. Not even her throne carried that much truth. This was her chamber pot. And it was never to be touched. Not by a handmaiden. Not by a servant. Not even by her confessor. Because to touch it meant to touch her, and Queen Isabella would not allow her body to be seen, even in absence. She kept her veil low and her boundaries high. Her flesh was sacred, and sacredness, to her, demanded distance. So the pot remained hidden beneath the altar where she knelt. Inches from where her prayers spilled. Inches from where her secrets leaked in silence. The room was cloaked in incense and dust. The air held the weight of a tomb. And there, beneath the veil of holiness, her waste fermented. She called it humility. She believed, truly, that refusing to let others clean her filth made her closer to the divine. That suffering in the scent of her own decay was a form of worship. That enduring the slow build of human odor, sealed in a clay bowl, was evidence of her discipline. So she didn't call for it to be emptied. Not daily. Not weekly. Maybe monthly. And only then, by someone specially chosen. A woman sworn to silence, cloaked in black, who would carry the pot in the dead of night like a relic from a battlefield. It wasn't dumped in haste, it was poured with reverence. As if sin were being bled into the earth. But by then, the damage was done. Because the pot was no longer just a tool. It was part of her. A shadow organ. A private monument to everything she denied. Its contents steeped beneath her prayers. Rising in slow waves. Intermingling with the aroma of beeswax candles and myrrh. No curtain could hide it. No lavender could mask it for long. Those who entered her chamber learned to breathe shallow, learned to bow quickly. The stench was the queen's silent doctrine. And yet, she never flinched. Not when she knelt before it. Not when her skirts brushed its rim. Not when the floor beneath it darkened with damp rings of rot. She saw it not as filth. But as faith. The chamber pot became a symbol. Not of bodily function. But of control. Control over her privacy. Control over her discomfort. Control over how close anyone was allowed to get. Because no one could clean it without seeing too much. And no one saw the queen. Even in her most human state, she remained a fortress. You picture it now. That small, foul bowl glowing beneath the candlelight. The marble altar above it gleaming with gold. One vessel holding scripture. The other, waste. And between them, her. Queen Isabella. Silent. Still. Praying with her mouth of sores. Crowned with hair thick with lice. And kneeling over her own stench, calling it sacred. You've just stepped into her sanctuary. You've knelt where angels were supposed to hover, and found rot. And still, you haven't subscribed to Tale of History. She shared her chamber pot with angels. You're still unsure about clicking a button. Be honest. Subscribe now, or step into the comments and tell us why you'd rather kneel beside a myth than rise with the truth. She stood alone in the chamber. Naked, except for a rosary wound tight around her wrist. The room thickened with smoke, gray, bitter, laced with burning resin. Frankincense. Myrrh. Laurel leaves. Crushed rosemary. The herbs cracked and hissed atop red coals, releasing coils of vapor that circled her like serpents. She called it cleansing. This was no bath. No basin. No touch of water to skin. That would have been indulgent, even sinful. Water made flesh soft. And softness, her confessors warned, was a gate through which temptation entered. So instead of washing, she fumigated. She stepped into rooms built for ritual, not for hygiene. Her hair undone. Her skin unwashed. Her prayers whispered into smoke. Naked not for vanity, but for sacrifice. The fumes rolled over her like a blessing, stung her eyes like confession. They curled beneath her arms, into the folds of her thighs, across her belly, filling every crevice where sweat once pooled, where rot had started to take root. But the filth remained. It baked into her skin beneath the heat. The pores opened, yes, but only to be sealed again by soot. The herbs could not erase the months of sweat. The incense could not lift what clung to her like a second skin. The smoke masked. It never removed. When she emerged from these rituals, she was dizzy. Her skin damp, not from moisture, but from the sheer weight of what hadn't left her. The scent followed her down the hallways of her palace, bitter herbs and hidden decay. Her servants bowed. Her confessors nodded. Her court said nothing. Because this was holy. Her advisors, scholars, monks, old men with waxy skin and sunken eyes, spoke of smoke as purification. They cited scripture. They compared her to temple rites in the Old Testament, where holy spaces were cleansed by burning incense, never touched by hand. If the tabernacle could be made clean without water, why not her? So she believed it. She became it. Each ritual deepened her conviction. The more she smoked, the more impure she felt. The more impure she felt, the more she smoked. A sacred cycle of futility. Of guilt. Of control. Because that's what it always came back to, control. To step into water would be to surrender. To let the elements reach her, strip her, see her. But smoke. Smoke obeyed her. It cloaked her. It whispered around her without asking questions. And she could emerge exactly as she chose to be seen, scented, shadowed, and still untouchable. You picture it now. A queen bathed not in cleanliness, but in illusion. Her hair thick with incense. Her chest raw from scratching. Her underarms red with rash, soot clinging to the edges of her gown. She wasn't clean. She was perfumed in fire. And the world let her be. You've now stood in her smoke-filled chamber. You've watched history choke on sanctity. You've smelled what she called salvation. And still, you haven't subscribed to tale of history. She walked through smoke instead of water. And you? You're watching from a distance, silent, still. Don't be passive. Don't be part of the mythmakers. Click subscribe. Or step into the comments and tell us why you'd rather inhale lies than face the burning truth. The body breaks in whispers before it ever screams. In Queen Isabella's case, the breaking came slow, beneath layers of linen, under corsets laced too tightly, in joints that bore the weight of a holy empire. Her flesh began to weep before she ever did. But no blade would touch her skin. No physician would inspect the rot blooming beneath royal robes. To let a man, even a healer, come close to her wounds was unthinkable. Unholy. She believed her body belonged not to medicine, but to God. So when the sores came, and they did come, she turned to olive oil and prayer. It was simple, peasant-like, humble by design. A cloth dipped in pressed oil from Andalusian groves. Dabbed gently. Not wiped. Not scrubbed. Just placed like a sacrament. Over skin that blistered. Under arms where folds of unwashed flesh had split. Behind knees rubbed raw from kneeling on stone. The oil glistened, yes. But it sealed in everything, sweat, bacteria, blood. And when the pain rose, she whispered. Not cries. Not commands. But prayers. To saints. To the Virgin. Sometimes, it was said, to no one at all, just murmurs, breath against the wound, as if words alone could cauterize. She called it divine suffering. Said the stinging was sacred. Said the sores were signs she was chosen. No court physician dared contradict her. They saw the swelling beneath her sleeves, the way she shifted in her throne to favor one side, the way her gait slowed on marble floors. They recorded it in their private diaries, lesions beneath the arms, reddish discharge at the joints, odor described as earthy rot. But no treatment was prescribed. Because the queen refused to be healed. To be healed, in her mind, was to admit brokenness. And she wasn't broken. She was being purified. Each sore became a relic. Each inflammation, a divine correction. Her body was no longer a temple, it was a battlefield, and God's hand, she believed, was the sword. So she oiled. She anointed. Not for comfort. Not for health. But for ritual. Each act of tending was a performance of faith. Her ladies-in-waiting were taught not to look too closely. They were instructed never to speak of the cloths, never to ask why the queen sometimes shook while dressing. The queen endured. And as the sores deepened, some say abscessed, she grew more resolute. Because the pain proved something. That her body was not hers. That her pain had purpose. That her suffering sanctified her rule. And now you've seen it. You've followed her into the quiet agony of untreated wounds. You've watched the olive oil shimmer over flesh that begged for medicine. You've heard the whispers in the dark, the prayers uttered through clenched teeth. And still you hesitate? Still haven't subscribed to Tale of History? She treated open wounds with nothing but oil and hope. You won't even lift a finger for truth? Then do it now. Click subscribe. Or enter the comments, and tell the queen herself why you'd rather soothe your comfort than confront her pain. There are things no chronicle dares put into ink. But the body keeps its own records. It writes in stains. In salt. In blood. And in Queen Isabella's case, that blood was never allowed to leave her with dignity. When her body bled. Monthly, quietly, beneath all her silks and sanctity, she did not cleanse it. She did not wash. She did not replace the cloths that caught it. She believed herself sacred. A vessel of God. A chosen queen whose body was not to be touched, tampered with, or made soft by earthly comforts. Even the flow of her own womanhood was treated not as a biological truth, but as a test of spiritual resolve. The rags were linen. Coarse. Sometimes wool. They were folded by hand and tucked into place. Tight, makeshift, clumsy. Not changed daily. Not even every few days. They were reused, again and again. Dried near the hearth, stiff with heat, heavy with old blood. There are whispered accounts from within her household, fragments preserved only in side notes. A lady-in-waiting who gagged while dressing the queen. A chambermaid who refused to enter the room during certain days of the month. A priest who described the smell in the confessional not as sin, but fermentation. Because that scent, the scent of drying blood trapped in cloth and sweat, was not something perfume could mask. It clung to her. It followed her through corridors, into chapels, onto the very floor of the throne room. But no one dared speak. To do so would be to question her body. And her body, she insisted, was holy. Menstruation was, at the time, considered unclean. A sign of female instability. Something to be hidden or cleansed or punished. But Isabella turned that belief inside out. She didn't cleanse it because she believed to cleanse it would be to deny God's will. Her flow was divine. Its discomfort, righteous. Its stench, unavoidable. To scrub it away would be to admit shame. And she had none. You imagine it now, those rags stiffened by fire, red baked into brown, reused until the fibers wore thin. You imagine the ache of days gone by, the rawness, the odor curling beneath her garments. She walked with it. Ruled with it. Prayed with it between her legs. And the world bowed anyway. Because history is not built on what was clean, it is built on what was endured. And now you know. You've stayed with her through every stage of bodily betrayal. You've walked behind her as blood pooled in silence. You've stood beside the altar and smelled the sacrifice no one acknowledged. So what's your excuse? If you've watched this far, through menstrual rags, rot, and ritual, then you already know why Tale of History exists. Click subscribe. Or go to the comments and tell us what's stopping you. Be honest. Don't hide behind silence. She didn't. The body was barely still. Laid flat in a chamber where incense thickened the air and veils were drawn tight against the light, the corpse of Queen Isabella did not go quietly. They had barely finished their prayers when the stench bloomed. It did not whisper, it shouted. Not the soft decay of old age, not the clean rot of a peaceful death, but something older, fouler, defiant. It pushed against the scented oils her ladies poured across her chest. It filled the room, curled into the robes that clung to her skin, and drove seasoned priests back from the altar. Her body had been kept as holy. But in death, it revolted. The linen beneath her blackened. The folds of her gown, unchanged for days, had fused with the flesh. They tried to lift it. It tore. Her abdomen, tight in life from corsets and fasting, ballooned with trapped air. Her jaw, stiff from decades of silence, opened slightly, not in peace, but in pressure. A gasp of release that carried with it something no one could explain. One priest, a man who had stood beside countless noble corpses, would later write that her presence overcame even God's oils. They sealed the windows. They stuffed the keyhole with wax. But nothing held the scent. The anointing began, thick layers of myrrh, frankincense, cedar sap. They draped her body in veils soaked in clove and rosemary. They rubbed camphor along her spine. They bound her wrists with cotton dipped in lavender and lye. They stuffed her mouth with cloth. But it leaked. The rot refused to stay silent. Because this wasn't new. This wasn't sudden. This was years of decay, denied. This was a body that had been told it was sacred, even as it blistered, bled, and begged for water. This was the legacy of a woman who believed pain was virtue, and that flesh should never soften under touch. So now, even in death, the message remained clear, she would not be cleansed. They tried to clean the bed. The oils seeped into the mattress and burned the linen. They tried to perfume the floor. The scent rose again by evening. And in the cathedrals of Castile, where her body was eventually displayed beneath layers of shroud and stone, visitors stood in line to see the queen. And whispered not of her glory, but of what lingered. The queen who launched empires. The queen who tore Granada from the Moors. The queen who bled beneath veils and reeked beneath crowns. Now rotting in the same veil. Still denying the water she feared her whole life. Even the worms, they said, came slower. It was not the decay that horrified them. It was the insistence. The insistence that death was just a continuation of discipline. That dignity was never to be washed away. And now you've witnessed it. You've seen her in the chamber, lain out in rot. You've watched the oils drip uselessly over blistered skin. You've breathed in what history tried to embalm. This is not the Isabella of legend. This is the Isabella that was hidden beneath it. And now you know. So what will you do? You've sat through every ritual, every infection, every prayer soaked in sweat. You've entered the tomb. And still haven't subscribed to Tale of History? She went to her grave unwashed. You're too clean to click a button. Do it now. Subscribe. Or descend into the comments and explain why you'd rather preserve a lie than honor the rotting truth. So now you know. Not just the victories or the marriages. Not just the edicts or the conquests. But the body. The real body. The one history sealed in gold, then buried in silence. You've traced the rot beneath her crown. You've walked behind her as blood thickened in reused cloth. You've watched her light sacred smoke instead of touching soap, bless sores instead of healing them, and call suffering divine while her skin split open beneath stiffened silk. This was the queen who united a kingdom. The monarch who birthed an empire, banished empires, blessed crusades. This was Isabella of Castile, the saint who stank. And now, maybe, you understand something darker, her faith was not just belief. It was denial weaponized. She didn't just refuse water, she refused flesh. To wash the body was to acknowledge its need, its softness, its filth, its humanity. And for her, there was no greater sin. Because in her world, the body was always the enemy. A vessel for temptation. A snare for pride. A reminder that beneath the title, beneath the lace and stone and centuries of praise, there was still a woman. And she couldn't allow that woman to be seen. So she sealed her. Layer by layer. Until all that remained was myth. And even then, especially then, the myth reeked. They canonized her ideals. They spoke of her sanctity. They painted her surrounded by angels and swords and marble. But marble cannot sweat. Angels do not bleed. She did. And now you have to ask yourself, how many of the saints we're told to admire were, in fact, rotting just like her? How many queens, kings, prophets, and conquerors walked through history cloaked not just in grandeur, but in discomfort? In lice. In illness. In guilt they turned into ritual. How many stories were edited to smell sweet? And how many truths were burned away like frankincense, meant to cover, never clean? You don't come here for comfort. You come here to see what lies beneath the veil. And you've seen it. You've smelled it. Now it's time to do what history rarely does. Acknowledge it. This is tale of history. We exhume. We disturb. We peel back the perfume and write with what was buried. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this. More queens sealed in silence. More empires built on blistered feet and blood-stained linen. Or, leave your excuse in the comments. Defend the lie if you must. But know this, she never flinched. She never hid. And now, neither can you. If your skin crawled, good. If your breath caught somewhere between horror and awe, good. Because history should do that. It should linger. Like rot in a chamber pot. Like incense over infected skin. Like the truth, once finally spoken. You came here expecting a crown. You stayed for what lived. And died, beneath it. If this disturbed you. If it fascinated you. If it pulled back the curtain you didn't know was there, then Tale of History is your home. Because here, we don't just retell the past. We excavate it. We scrape beneath the gold. We sift through what the perfumes tried to hide. We do not flinch. And we will not stop. Subscribe. Comment. Share it. You are not just an observer now. You're part of the unmasking. Because what we reveal here, it isn't just story. It's skin. Raw. Ravaged. Remembered. And if you look away now, that silence becomes yours.